The dog smelled him before the headlights found him. They were crossing the Sutter Creek Bridge outside of Laurel Falls, Montana, at 11 minutes past midnight in the third week of November, when Ghost went rigid in the passenger seat. Not the slow lean of attention. Rigid, forepaws on the dash, every muscle in his body locked toward the darkness below the bridge's east rail. A sound building low in his chest that wasn't a growl and wasn't a whine, but something in between, the frequency Ghost reserved for things that existed between alarm and grief. Marcus Reyes had been driving on empty highway for 4 hours and had been thinking about nothing in particular, and he pulled the truck over without asking himself why. That was one of the things service had taken from him and never given back. The ability to hear that sound from the dog and decide it was probably nothing. He got out into the Montana cold, which in November at midnight is not a temperature so much as a condition. It occupied the inside of the lungs and the back of the throat and the tips of the ears in the way that cold only does when there are no buildings around to interrupt it. He went to the rail and looked down. The creek below was frozen at the edges and black at the center, maybe 15 feet down. On the east bank of the creek, underneath the bridge's near support, a man was sitting with his back against the concrete and his legs straight out in front of him, and his head dropped forward on his chest. He was not moving. He was not dressed for this. Before we go any further, tell us where you're watching from in the comments below. If this story moves you, please subscribe and stay with us all the way to the end. What this old soldier's story turned out to be, and what Ghost helped make possible, is something no one in Laurel Falls expected. We read every single comment. Let's find out how far this one travels. Marcus Reyes was 43 years old and built the way men are built who have never fully stopped being what the Navy made them. Not for vanity. Not for anyone's approval. Simply because the body holds its training the way language holds its first words. Deep and structural, and not easily revised. He was 6'1", carrying 215 pounds across a frame that was proportioned for work rather than appearance. Broad in the chest and back, heavy through the forearms in the particular way of men who have spent years in water and on ropes. His hair was black and cut close, going gray now at the temples, and his face was the kind of face that had been weathered by years of environments that were not designed for human comfort. Dark-complexioned, with a strong jaw and a nose that had been broken once and set itself slightly to the left, and lines at the corners of his eyes that were not entirely the product of age. His eyes were a dark, liquid brown that people sometimes described as warm and then revised immediately. Because warmth was not quite right. What they were was present, fully and completely present, the way the eyes of men who have been in actual danger are present, registering everything without reacting to most of it. He was not a man who startled. He was not a man who missed things. He had served 12 years as a Navy SEAL, 4 of them as a Chief Petty Officer with SEAL Team 7. With deployments in Helmand Province, the Anbar region of Iraq, and a long period of classified work in the Horn of Africa, he was not at liberty to discuss and rarely thought about without conscious effort. He had come home from his last deployment with a compressed vertebra in his lower back, a recurring shoulder impingement from a fast rope incident in 2019, and a separation from the institution that had defined his adult life that he had not, in the 2 years since, found any clean way to process. He lived in a rented cabin 12 miles outside Laurel Falls that he had found online and signed a year's lease on without visiting first, which was either the best or worst decision he had made since discharge, depending on the week. He did contract work for a private security firm when he needed money and otherwise did not do much of anything he could name. He was trying to figure out what came next. He had been trying for 2 years. He had not yet figured it out. Ghost was a 5-year-old Belgian Malinois, with a coat the color of dark wheat and charcoal, fawn along the legs and face, and deepening to black across the saddle and muzzle, with amber eyes so bright and direct they unsettled people who met them for the first time. He weighed 67 pounds, which was lighter than most people expected when they saw the density of muscle moving beneath that coat. He had a long scar along his left flank, 6 inches of hairless, slightly puckered skin, where a piece of metal from a breached door in Mosul had caught him at a dead sprint in 2021. The wound had been serious. The vet at the forward operating base had told Marcus that Ghost might not work again. Ghost had returned to full operational status in 11 weeks. The scar had remained. It sat on his side like a signature, proof of a day he had continued anyway. Ghost moved with the controlled, coiled efficiency of a Malinois at the absolute top of his training, light on his feet, alert in every direction simultaneously, with the specific behavioral quality that Marcus had come to think of as directed calm, not stillness, but force that had been given a channel. He had spent 3 years working with Ghost in operational environments where confusion was dangerous and hesitation could be fatal. And the result was a partnership built on something closer to fluency than command. Ghost did not wait to be told what Marcus needed. He read Marcus the way Marcus read a room, and he was rarely wrong. The bridge at Sutter Creek was a single-lane concrete span built in 1961, low and functional, carrying County Road 18 over a tributary of the Blackfoot River that cut through the southeast corner of Cascade County like an afterthought. It was the kind of infrastructure that nobody thought about until it was gone. The night around it was the particular dark of rural Montana in November. Not the dark of power outages or overcast skies, but the deep, absolute dark that exists where there are no streetlights, no houses close enough to matter, and the moon has not yet cleared the ridge to the east. The stars above were excessive, the way they only are at altitude and distance from civilization, throwing enough ambient light to see the shape of the hills, but not the ground beneath your feet. The creek below made a sound that was half water and half ice, a slow grinding that carried in the cold air. And the wind off the ridge came in intermittent gusts that made the temperature feel a full 10 degrees colder than it was, which was already 10 degrees colder than it had any business being in a place where people were expected to survive. Marcus did not hesitate at the rail. He called out once. The man below did not move. He went back to the truck, got his flashlight, found the access trail that ran down the bank on the east side of the bridge, and descended into the dark with Ghost at his knee. The creek bank was frozen grass and loose rock, and he picked his way down it without rushing, because a twisted ankle out here in the dark was a problem with no good solution. The old man was alive. Barely, and with a specific quality of barely that Marcus recognized from contexts he did not particularly want to revisit. The shallow, inconsistent breathing of advanced hypothermia. The gray-blue tint to the lips, the skin of the hands gone past cold into something else. He was wearing a canvas work jacket over a flannel shirt over a thermal undershirt. And his boots were cracked leather, and he had no hat. He had been here for a while. He had been here long enough that the cold had gotten all the way inside. His name, Marcus found the wallet in his jacket pocket, because the man could not speak, was Earl Thomas Giddings. He was 81 years old. The wallet also contained a Veterans of Foreign Wars membership card, a photograph worn soft at the edges of a woman in a garden, and a folded and refolded piece of paper that Marcus did not open because it was not his. There was $11 in the billfold. There was no phone. Marcus had a satellite communicator on his belt. He had a Mylar emergency blanket in the kit behind the truck's rear seat, and a sleeping bag rated to -20, and a wool blanket he'd started carrying after his first Montana winter, and hand warmers in the glove compartment by habit. He had Ghost. He keyed the communicator and sent a location request for emergency services. Because the communicator did not make voice calls, but it sent coordinates, and he had registered it with Cascade County Search and Rescue the first week after he'd moved in. Then, he went back up the bank and got everything warm that he had. Ghost did not follow him back up. Ghost stayed. Marcus looked back once from the bank trail and saw the dog pressed against the old man's side in the dark, a pale amber shape against the concrete, applying the particular warmth that a 67-pound working dog can provide by virtue of being alive and choosing to stay close. It was not a thing Marcus had trained him to do. It was the kind of thing Ghost did because Ghost understood situations. Earl Thomas Giddings had been born in 1943 in a farmhouse outside Great Falls, Montana, the second of 4 children, and had been drafted in 1963 at the age of 20 and served 2 tours in Vietnam with the 1st Cavalry Division as a rifleman and later as a squad leader in the Ia Drang Valley and the Central Highlands. During a period of the war that military historians discussed with the careful specificity reserved for events whose full cost had never been completely tallied. He had come home in 1966 with a Bronze Star, a limp from shrapnel in his right thigh, and the particular difficulty of re-entry that Vietnam veterans were not given vocabulary or support to name at the time. He had built a life anyway, married Margaret Elaine Foskett in 1968, worked 34 years for the Montana Department of Transportation, maintaining roads in Cascade and Lewis and Clark counties, raised 2 children, buried a son, and retired in 2001 to the house on Pitcher Road outside Laurel Falls, where he had lived with Margaret until Margaret died of pancreatic cancer in the spring. That was 6 months before Marcus found him under the bridge. What Marcus learned later from the ER attending physician in Great Falls, from Earl's daughter Connie, who drove 4 hours from Billings to reach the hospital, from the paperwork and the discharge summary and the things Connie said sitting in the hospital corridor with a paper cup of coffee going cold in her hands, was that Earl had stopped eating consistently after Margaret died, that he had lost 22 pounds between May and November, that his neighbors had noticed he wasn't picking up his mail and had called Connie twice, and Connie had called Earl twice, and Earl had said he was fine, and Connie was dealing with her own grief over her mother, and had believed him, because believing him was easier than not believing him. That Earl had taken to walking the county roads in the evening, which he had always done, which Margaret had always done with him, and that the walks had grown longer as the fall deepened, and that on the evening Marcus found him, he had walked 6 miles from the house on Pitcher Road, and had simply stopped at the bridge in the dark and sat down, and could not find a reason to get up again. He had not been trying to die, he had just stopped trying to live, which is a different thing, and in a Montana November at midnight, it leads to the same outcome, with only slightly less intention. He was in the hospital for 6 days. The hypothermia was serious, but reversible. The malnutrition took longer. Connie drove back to Billings on the 3rd day because she had children and a job and a life that didn't stop. And she left her number at the nurse's station and felt the particular guilt of someone who understands that they have made the correct practical decision while knowing it is not the same as the right one. Marcus was there on the 4th day. He had driven the 40 miles to Great Falls to confirm that the person he had pulled off a frozen creek bank was going to be a person still, and he had not expected to stay. And he had stayed for 3 hours, because Earl had been awake, and Earl had started talking, and Marcus had found that he was not able to make himself stop listening. Earl talked the way old men from that part of Montana talked, slowly, without waste, with the cadences of a man who had spent most of his working life outdoors and had learned to pace himself against the long hours. He talked about Margaret. He talked about the garden she had kept, tomatoes and snap peas, and a climbing rose along the south fence she had planted in 1974 and tended every year until she couldn't. He talked about the Ia Drang in the way men talk about places that cost them something, directly, without flinching, but with a careful economy that told Marcus he had been holding this for a long time without a listener. He talked about the walk that had ended at the bridge, not apologetically, just factually, the way he might describe a road that had turned out to be longer than expected. "I wasn't trying to go anywhere in particular," Earl said. "I just stopped knowing which direction was back." Marcus sat with that for a while. "I know that one," he said. Ghost was on the floor beside Marcus's chair, which the nurse had looked at with some skepticism before deciding not to address. His chin was on his forepaws. His amber eyes tracked Earl when Earl spoke. When Marcus spoke, Ghost's eyes moved to Marcus. At a certain point in the conversation, Earl's hand dropped from the bed rail toward the floor in the absent way hands move when a person isn't thinking about them, and Ghost moved his head 4 inches until Earl's fingers rested in the fur behind his ears, and Earl's hand stayed there without either of them making a decision about it. They drove Earl home from the hospital on the 6th day, Marcus in the truck, Ghost in the passenger seat, Earl in the back with a discharge summary and a list of follow-up appointments, and a prescription for an antidepressant that the psychiatrist had discussed with him at length, and that Earl had agreed to try with the cautious, non-committal manner of a man who had survived 75 years by not making promises he wasn't sure he could keep. The house on Pitcher Road was cold. The heat had been on its lowest setting for weeks. Marcus went in first and turned it up. Earl's kitchen had almost nothing in it. The garden along the south fence was the bare architecture of what it had been when Margaret was alive. The rose canes cut back for winter, the beds mulched, everything tended to its last possible preparation before the cold took it. Somebody had done that work, Marcus realized. Earl had done it. He had put the garden to bed for winter in the weeks after Margaret died, because that was what you did when something you loved was going to have to survive the cold alone. The thing that Marcus did not entirely plan, but that happened nonetheless, was that he came back. He told himself the first time it was to bring groceries, which was true. He told himself the second time it was to check on the heat, which was also true. By the 4th or 5th time, he had stopped telling himself anything particular. He came in the truck with Ghost, and he sat in Earl's kitchen and drank Earl's coffee, which was terrible, and they talked. Sometimes about the war. Earl's war first, which was Vietnam, and then Marcus's wars, which were more diffuse and geographically spread and legally less discussable, and which Marcus found he could say more about to an 81-year-old veteran in a Montana kitchen than he had been able to say to any of the therapists the VA had assigned him. Sometimes they didn't talk about anything in particular. Ghost lay under the kitchen table and was content. Content was not an emotion Marcus had associated with Ghost in operational environments. It turned out to be a mode Ghost was capable of, given the right conditions. He started bringing food that was not groceries, things he had cooked in the cabin, which surprised him because he had not cooked with any real intention since discharge. A pot of soup, initially, then bread, because he had found Earl's copy of a 1970s Montana homesteading cookbook on the shelf, and had started reading it in the evenings with the particular absorption of someone who has discovered a useful thing. Earl ate. Earl's color improved. Earl started picking up his mail again. A neighbor named Dot Halverson, who lived a mile east on Pitcher Road and had been quietly watching the house since Margaret died, knocked on the door in December to say she was glad to see the lights on later in the evenings, and Earl introduced her to Marcus, and Dot shook Marcus's hand with both of hers and held it for a moment longer than a handshake strictly required. The thing Marcus had not expected happened in January. Earl found Ghost's scar. They were sitting after dinner, and Ghost had pressed his head against Earl's knee the way he had taken to doing, and Earl's hand found the long ridge of hairless skin along Ghost's left flank and went still. What happened to him? Earl said. Marcus told him. Door breach in Mosul. Fragment from the hinge. Ghost at a dead sprint, which was the only reason it hadn't been worse. 11 weeks to full duty. The vet had said it shouldn't have been possible. Earl's hand moved slowly along the scar. Ghost settled deeper against his leg and made the low sound he made when something was exactly right. He knows, Earl said. Knows what? Marcus said. What it is to keep going anyway. Earl looked at the dog, then at Marcus. The two of you both know that one. That's why he found me under that bridge. God doesn't send what we deserve. He sends what we need. He said it the way he said most things, without drama, as a statement of observed fact. I needed someone who had kept going after something that should have stopped them. Marcus was quiet for a while. Outside, the January dark had settled over the fields of Pitcher Road. The kitchen light was on. It made the window a mirror. He could see them both in it. The old man in his chair, the dog between them, and himself, which he had been finding easier to look at lately, without immediately looking away. Connie Giddings came back in February, driving from Billings on a Saturday, because her father had called her and asked her to. The first time he had asked her for anything since Margaret died. She sat at Earl's kitchen table and looked at Marcus for a long moment. He's 20 pounds heavier than he was in October, she said. He's on the medication. He's been talking about putting the garden in this spring. She paused. I don't know how to say what I want to say. You don't have to, Marcus said. She said it anyway. Thank you. It is March now. Or it was March when this part of the story happened, and the snow on Pitcher Road has receded to the north, facing slopes where it always holds longest, and the earth in Margaret's garden is beginning to have that particular quality of possibility that Montana soil has for 2 or 3 weeks before the last hard freeze. Earl is in the garden most mornings now. He walks the south fence where the rose canes are starting to bud, checking the progress the way he checked his road crew's progress for 34 years, with quiet attention, noting what is ahead of schedule and what is behind. His color is good. He has gained back nearly all of what he lost. The walk he takes most evenings now goes west rather than east, away from the bridge, along the flatter road that follows the creek but from a distance. And he does not go 6 miles anymore. 2 is enough. 2 is the right length for a walk that is for the sake of walking. Ghost goes with him on Tuesdays and Thursdays, when Marcus brings him over for the afternoon. The dog walks between Earl and the road with the attentiveness of a working dog who has been given a job he considers important, which is accurate, because Ghost decides what he considers important and cannot be argued out of it. His scar has faded slightly with the winter, the skin over it gone from deep pink to a pale silver that catches the light on the right angle. Earl calls him Sergeant. Ghost has not corrected him. On the last Tuesday in March, Earl stopped on the walk at the top of the little rise where you can see the creek valley below and the bridge at Sutter Creek in the middle distance, and he stood and looked at it for a while without speaking. Ghost sat beside him and looked at the same thing, which is a behavior Ghost had not been trained to do, and which was, Marcus thought when Earl told him about it later, not about the bridge at all. It was about the man looking at it. It was about being present with someone while they looked at something hard, which is a different skill from looking away, and which Ghost had apparently considered part of his job since November. Marcus's back still hurts. The shoulder is some days better and some days worse. He has not figured out what comes next, exactly, but he has stopped thinking of that as a failure and started thinking of it as a condition. The state of being between one thing and another, which is not the same as being lost. He planted garlic in October in the raised bed behind his cabin, following instructions from the homesteading cookbook, and it came up in March in the way garlic comes up, green and certain, and without apparent concern for the winter it has just survived. He is going to plant tomatoes in May if the last frost cooperates. He told Earl this, and Earl told him about the variety Margaret had grown, a Montana heirloom she'd gotten from her own grandmother, seeds saved and replanted for 4 decades. Earl gave him a small envelope of them from the coffee can in the pantry where Margaret had kept them. Marcus planted 3 seeds in a pot on the cabin windowsill in late February to see if they would germinate. 2 of them did. He considers this a reasonable outcome. Sometimes miracles don't arrive as fire from the sky or voices that explain themselves. Sometimes they cross a bridge at midnight because a dog went rigid and pressed his paws against the dashboard and made a sound that meant something was wrong down in the dark, and a man who had been trained to pay attention did not look away. God does not always send rescue through the obvious channels or in the expected forms. He sends it through the people who are awake when everyone else is asleep, through animals who carry their loyalty in scar tissue and amber eyes, through the simple act of returning to a cold kitchen with a pot of soup and no particular plan beyond showing up. The world is full of people who have stopped being able to find the direction back, who have survived wars and loss and long years of quiet grief, and who are sitting somewhere in the dark without enough warmth to last the night. Most of the time we don't stop. Sometimes someone does. Sometimes that someone has a dog who knew first, and that turns out to be enough. If Earl's story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs to be reminded that being found is possible, even at midnight, even under a bridge, even after everything. Leave us a comment and tell us where you're watching from, and tell us this: have you ever stopped for someone the world was passing by? Your story might be the thing that convinces someone else to pull over. And if you believe in stories of loyalty, return, and the quiet courage of ordinary people who show up, please subscribe to the channel so you never miss the next journey. May God bless you. Protect your family, and keep your eyes open for the ones sitting in the dark who cannot find the direction back alone.